Hello and welcome to lesson number 1 of art history. So the topic of the lesson today is the still life. As you remember when I mentioned in the introduction, I chose to work with you with this topic of the still life because it's a topic which directly addresses the relationships between objects in space and in a representational field. And since this course on art history is originally intended for students of interior design, but it can also be for students of architecture or urban planning or art. So the idea of preparing this course with a focus on the still life has this very practical concern that you can apply what you learn to your design projects. So, for example, whenever you're thinking about arranging objects in space, so for example, in a room, or arranging furniture in a room, or preparing uh, a window for a store, for example, a display, uh, this kind of situation. So you can think about how you can use what you learn about the still life to create this kind of staged situations. Of course, you can also apply this kind of ideas, for example, if you have to prepare a stage design, or if you have to prepare an installation or a performance, or any situation in which you have the challenge or the creative task of arranging objects in space. And added to this idea of the still life and the objects in space, I also want to add this performative component. So the idea that not just the objects in space, but also the human body in relationship to the objects. So as I mentioned before, you have this exercise to do and you will develop it at different scales. So, origins of the still life. So the still life is a genre that originated in painting, and the first still lives, although they were not called still lives, but what we can say would be the original or the first traces of what could be the still life, go all the way back to ancient Egypt. So there are friezes and there are representations from ancient Egypt where we see human figures, of course, and then we see also the depiction of objects which would be used by the pharaohs or by the deceased, by the dead ones who would be entombed. Um, and so these paintings would have depictions of objects and things that they would be using in the afterlife. So of course they had meanings. They were all highly symbolic, but most of these objects were objects of daily life, including, for example, food, um, baskets, cups. So all these objects which supported the daily life, and so they would have a function. So in ancient Egypt it was believed that there would be an afterlife, so the objects would serve the purpose of continually supporting the rituals and the habits of daily life of the dead person, but at the same time uh, bringing a remembrance of the pleasures and of the things that this person enjoyed while being alive. So that in the afterlife, all these things like the fish one really liked to eat, or for example, that these things would continue and be available in the afterlife. So the still life normally represents these objects which give some form of sensorial delight, sensorial enjoyment, and are, although symbolically they do have these metaphysical connotations, they are always earthly bound. So they are always connected to life, to material life on earth, although with this kind of existential connotation. So these would be the origins of the still life. Also in ancient Rome, there were found traces in Pompeii, for example, of still life motifs in mosaics, for example. So also representations of things, for example, like fruit and food, and also small animals, which were mostly also to eat. So this was also something that was found in ancient Rome, although in ancient Rome it had a little bit a different character than in ancient Egypt. In ancient Rome, these still lives did not have a funerary meaning. They were normally in mosaics in areas where people would eat. So they were used also as a kind of sensorial display of the things that people enjoy to eat. And of course, you all know about the legendary Roman banquets and also orgies, which included food. And so this kind of sensorial representations and sensorial displays also, of course, have to do with this kind of interest that also existed in ancient Rome, in culture and in food and sensorial delight, so earthly pleasures. Later in the Middle Ages, we can say that that's when because these representations in the ancient world, in ancient Egypt and in ancient Rome, they although in ancient Egypt they were highly symbolic, they were still somehow decorative, also in ancient Rome. In the Middle Ages, these representations, which were still not called still life, this is a term that appears later, but we can classify them as proto-still lifes. So in the Middle Ages, there were also representations in the style of the still life. So everyday objects again, fruits, flowers, but also symbolic objects like a skull or a candle or books. And this kind of objects had also the added component of narrative, of telling a story. And in the Middle Ages, these narratives, of course, and this kind of painting, proto-still life painting, they were connected to religious, they were depicting religious themes and also religious values. So, for example, this can be seen in the paintings of Giotto and some of his followers. So these depictions also had the same kind of objects, although adding also these symbolic objects with religious meanings. So then in the Renaissance, the still life continued to be developed in this direct connection to religious themes, and of course Christian iconography. Although in the Renaissance the repertoire of still lifes, so the kind of objects that were depicted were a little bit wider, but in most cases, so for example in the Middle Ages, the still lifes representations, one can see it, for example, and there's a lot of variety, but in the treatment of the light, how the light is treated in the paintings. The background, usually it's very dark, and the objects represent a kind of austerity, and also the narrative being very religiously focused has a very strong morbid connotation, although these still lives were still not called vanitas, although they were a reflection already on these topics, for example, of life and death. So, For example, in the Middle Ages, since many of these still lifes were developed according to religious themes, the depiction of pieces of fruit or vegetables, so this kind of consumable objects, they were depicted as objects of sensorial delight, but they were depicted in a way that showed how in some ways inaccessible they should be. And this was to express an idea of austerity and an idea of virtue. Um, some of the painters who developed this kind of still lives in the Middle Ages, they were monks, and they painted in monasteries, and so they had this kind of they used the still life also to reflect on the earthly pleasures that they knew existed, but which, due to their condition, due to their life, they had chosen, or it had happened that these pleasures were renounced. So they were aware of the presence of such pleasures, but these pleasures were not renowned. And often the still lives of the Middle Ages show exactly this situation. So they are objects of desire. This is something that is present in the still life from the beginning. They represent objects of desire. The meaning we give to these objects, but also what we perceive when we look at them from the material world, of the experiences we can have with these objects. So often they are also highly sensuous. In the Renaissance, the depiction of still lives became, although it was still bound to religious topics, became less austere, so a little bit less strict, one could say, and became progressively more and more sensuous. So, of course, in the Renaissance, especially in Italy, the techniques of painting were becoming more and more sophisticated because of the development of the chiaroscuro. So this technique in oil painting, which allowed to depict objects with a very high level of realism. So in the Renaissance, of course, this was highly explored, and the idea was really to create these still lives to show the virtuosity of the painter, so the technical competence and achievement. But at the same time, also in the Renaissance, we know that most artists and painters were very, very interested in studying nature. So the idea of the still lives of the Renaissance was also to show not just virtuosity in painting, but show really display how this variety of objects could be depicted also under different light conditions, because the chiaroscuro is a technique that really allows a lot of exploration of contrasts, strong contrasts between light and dark. In the 16th century, in the Netherlands, the still life appeared as a genre. So it appears as a real style of painting in itself. And it was normally commissioned by, it was free from religious influence, so it was commissioned normally by private commissioners who would make this kind of requests to an artist to depict a still life. And in the 16th century, the artist had a lot of freedom to choose the motives and the objects which would be depicted. So, for example, in the Netherlands in the 16th century, there was already a tradition before, which is called the Monumental still life, and these were very large-scale paintings, which had also human figure. So, and they already had a very strong narrative character. So, sometimes the stories depicted were around classical myths, for example, or other kind of stories. Sometimes also religious stories, but also historical scenes. And often in this kind of monumental still life, which always had a very theatrical representation, there were already arrangements of clusters, one can say, arrangements of flowers and of fruits and of objects of daily life, which were depicted because of their symbolic meaning, so that they would give to the scene depicted in the painting, that they would give more clues to the viewer to observe the painting and create a narrative in his or her mind. So this was the monumental still life, which was developed in large-scale paintings. And that's what in the Netherlands led to the appearance of the still life. The still life or still lives in the Netherlands in the beginning were developed at small scale, and they were really focused only in these objects at hand's reach. But since the Netherlands at the time were very, very prosperous, there was also from the side of the commissioners a desire to have paintings which would display their economic power, and also to show the kind of food they enjoyed, and to show the kind of objects that they were able to have in their environment. So often these still lives depict, of course, sometimes, of course, fruits, different kinds of sensuous, very sensuous fruits, flowers, since in the Netherlands horticulture or the breeding and cultivation of flowers was really something very important. So the tulip was a very frequent and appreciated motive for the Dutch still lives. And what also happened often in this still life was that, because this was the time when the people who were doing these commissions were also building in their own homes the curiosity cabinets you probably already heard about. It was also this interest in collecting things that came from other countries and other cultures. So as you know, the Dutch had a very big tradition in sailing, and they were prosperous because of the trade routes. So there was a lot of influence from other cultures, and also objects and materials that came from other places. So many of these still lives from Dutch painting of the 16th century, they really show and want to display not just the local fruits and vegetables, but also some of these special objects. So often we see shells, we also see special precious objects that one could have as a privileged person in his collection at home. So very fine crystals or silverware, plates, cutlery, also cloths, which were done with the finest embroidery, porcelain. So all these kind of things that were being collected for the households, and that were shown in the painting as display of wealth and also as display of sensorial delight. Many of these paintings also depicted scenes, not scenes, but animals which were from hunting, so hunted birds or rabbits, and also, for example, large pieces of meat. And so this kind of objects, which we could classify as pantry objects. So cheese, butter, um, all these kind of objects that one would have in store in a pantry. And the idea was, because often at this time, which was kind of a paradoxical situation, um, some of the commissioners didn't have access to these precious goods very, very frequently. They would have them in specific times, and of course they would last, they were made to last, but it wasn't like we got used to. Now it's actually changing a little bit. It wasn't a steady supply of fine thousand varieties of cheese and ham and all these things. So it was very small quantities, and these quantities had to last for a long time. So often these people knew that they could have every now and then access to such goods, but it wasn't always the case. So the paintings, and having these paintings in the house, was also a way to remind them of these enjoyments. But also to display that they knew what they were, that they were able to eat them, and so on. But they were also done for their atmospheric character. Because these still lifes, they are objects of seduction. They work with the idea of desire, and they work with the idea of all these things which stimulate the eyes. So of course we see them through the eyes. But they are also very realistically depicted, so that when the viewer looks at them, doesn't see them only with the eyes, but has all these associations of tastes and smells and also of touch. So the way the realistic representation of the objects, for example, often there's paintings, still life paintings with peaches, and one can really see the furry texture, soft texture of the peach, or oysters, and one can see the gooey texture of the oysters. And so sometimes some of these still life paintings include live animals as well, because some of these commissioners also had pets at home, and the pets, for example, dogs or cats, they were domesticized, of course. And this was also a way to show the lifestyle that one had, while at the same time including something which was alive, and it had also kind of a sensorial component. Although these are more exceptional. Standard still lifes normally include only dead, immovable things. So classically from the origin, one could say. Of course, this developed immensely, and the still life still today, of course, is addressed. And as we will develop through the course, we will see that there's many approaches to the still life. But in origin, in its essence, it had only mostly these dead, immovable, not movable objects. Also, the classical representation of the still life, as originally done by Dutch painting in the Netherlands in the 16th century, was objects presented on a table. This was the original classical depiction of the still life. A little bit before, in the Middle Ages, sometimes these proto-still lifes were depicted on shelves or in a kind of cupboard or cabinet. But these are not the classical still life representation. They are still connected to religious motives, and so because they were in niches, so they were adjusted to this niche representation, which was found in churches and other devotional spaces. They don't follow the exact classical definition of a representation of a still life. Although further in the 20th century, this was again picked up, and the still life did happen to be developed not just on the table. But the table is the standard classical representation of the still life. And this is especially important to mention because when the still life was again picked up in the 20th century by the Cubists, who really revived the still life. Um, in most of the paintings, the table is present. So, because they wanted to pick up this archetype of the still life. Something that is also really important to address about the still life is that for a long time in art history, so only until about middle of the 20th century, the still life started to be explored, and this was mostly because of the influence of Cubism, of course, and how the importance of the avant-garde, and how the avant-garde really also worked a lot with the still life. But for a long time in the history of art, the still life was considered the lowest of the art representations. So it was considered of the least importance, because it depicted worldly matters. It didn't depict normally glorious themes or very important narratives. So it was really, so for example, in comparison with a portrait, who was always dedicated to a person or to a saint or to a king, and so on. So in comparison, or landscape painting was also considered lower, although higher than the still life. So the still life was really considered inferior. Often this was also connected to the fact that some of the artists after the Dutch tradition who worked with the still life, they worked with the still life as a motive because they didn't have much access to big commissions and to do big themes. So they worked with these small scale paintings with daily objects. Because first of all, this still life is a genre that offers, although it seems very restricted, it offers a lot of possibilities of exploration, exactly because it works with small objects. And then one can work not to create the narratives only by really, we could say, fine-tuning the relationships between the objects, the treatment of the light, the way the color and so on is represented. So, and this was what was done by in the 19th century by, for example, Van Gogh, who picked up the still life, and at the time not very not considered very successfully or understood, but he picked up the still life as he discovered that to work with these objects, he also didn't have many means, but to work with these objects was also the possibility of not being focused on the realistic representation of the objects there, but to really focus on the expressive character and on the interior world, how one can represent one's interior world, and also interpretation of observation of nature in the depiction of these objects, but most of all, being liberated of this idea of realistic representation of the objects, being able to really explore the possibilities of color and also of movement and depiction of movement. So this was one of the things that Van Gogh did, and he really had he really worked with the still life in this way. Other artists that also, two other artists that became very influential and that for the avant-garde and that worked with still life, for example, Manet, also did the same in his specific way, specific kind of representation. And then, of course, Cezanne. Cezanne would be really important. Cezanne really devoted most of his work to the still life. Even when he depicted, for example, mountain views and so on, we can see them that they are very closely connected. They are, of course, one can say they're landscape paintings, but they have a lot of this still life character. So I wouldn't make a distinction there. And one can see how Cezanne really took advantage of being liberated of this, liberating himself of, first of all, of perspective. That was Cezanne's biggest contribution. And starting to show these objects arranged on a table with a cloth. So supposedly the original still life repertoire of representation, but starting to show these objects from different views or different angles. And this was what led to Cubism. Cezanne made this proposal that everything we could see in nature could be reduced in terms of representation to solids, cubes, spheres, and cones. So there was already this idea of trying to abstract the representation, and also in the paintings of Cezanne, since he was not using color to depict objects, we could say photorealistically, he was using the color to give also an idea of texture. But texture not in a photorealistic way, but texture in this very plastic way. So we could say almost sculptural. And if you look closely at the paintings of Cezanne, you can really see the difference between, if you compare it with the standard still life representation, you can really see the differences in terms of how the brush stroke is faceted, and it doesn't have this kind of chiaroscuro, this kind of treatment of or dégradé of how from light to shade very gradually. So it's a completely different way of depicting the objects in this very haptic. So in this way, that has a lot to do with the sense of touch. So this is to give you a little bit background, retrospective, and now we start with already the very beginnings of the avant-garde, so of the 20th century. The first Cubist painting we can say is considered the Demoiselles d'Avignon from Pablo Picasso, which includes human figures, includes bodies of women, and includes also some of them with masks. Picasso was very interested in, at the time it was called primitivism, so it was interested in what at the time were considered exotic cultures, and so he was drawing African masks, and he was very interested in this kind of representations from African artifacts in general. And although he often denied that this was not such a strong influence, there's historical records that Picasso, before he was in Paris, when he was still living in Barcelona, that he was visiting the ethnographic museum and really had contact with this kind of artifacts. So they influenced his work. So although the Demoiselles d'Avignon is not a still life, we can see from the kind of representation that Picasso was already on to something that led to the development of Cubism. And then Cubism appeared, and Picasso working with Prague, they were living together and they developed this kind of language. There's a lot about Cubism that is still not known, many things that were not explained, but most of all, and we can really always see it in the still lifes, what Cubist representation of still lifes does is that it completely breaks away from any realistic representation of the objects, so perspective doesn't exist anymore, and what we see is always the different facets, so different aspects of the objects in a representational field. So for example, if a Cubist still life depicting bottles and glasses and a pipe on a table, the table doesn't appear as a horizontal object. It appears vertically, and the objects are arranged and shown not in just one side, but in many different sides, and at the same time, they show that they can be seen not just from one side, but from multiple viewpoints. So the whole idea, as described by Gombrich of Cubism, was to depict not the objects as they are, but the objects as we know that they are. Also because when we look at Cubist paintings, for example, still lifes, we can see that the representation shows I can look at a table and see these glasses, but I can imagine that if I move around from different angles and so, these objects will look completely different. So it has to do also with this idea of the, in a way, the limitations of visual perception. And for that reason, Picasso invented something called the papier-collé. So these collages, when he started to apply other materials, so breaking away just from drawing and painting, so he started to apply other materials with real texture on the surface to represent the objects. Often these were, for example, in a still life, which would represent objects on the table, there would be a fragment of a table there. So the table was represented not just in terms of drawing or in terms of painting, but with a fragment of the object itself. And this idea of fragmentation was, of course, very important in Cubism, because that's exactly how the representation worked, by all these fragments of the reality put together. Picasso also said that to represent a face, one only needs to have the eye, the nose, the mouth, and the contour, and then assemble it whatever way one wants. So it was really this whole idea of completely breaking with any classical kind of representation. It's also important to say that Picasso had his own personal agenda, so to say, to completely break free from, to intentionally break free from any kind of rules of classical representation, since he was actually educated in a very classical tradition. When he was still very, very young, before his 20s, he was already able to paint as a Renaissance master. He was instructed by his father, who wanted to bring him as fast as possible, and this was always a very difficult personal conflict for him. So Picasso's idea was really to completely break free from any kind of classical tradition, although he was always incorporating the classical tradition and the classical themes and recycling and subversing them. So this was also his formula, and it was the formula of all the avant-garde. So the idea of the avant-garde was really to completely break away from the traditions, and sometimes by doing something completely unseen, but often by picking up what already existed, and completely subverting the rules of this tradition. So all of the movements, big movements of the avant-garde, picked up the still life as a motive, since often many of these artists of the avant-garde in the beginning did not have much means, and again the still life, by working with these objects at hands, the objects at hands reached, allowed a lot of experimentation. At the same time, since the still life doesn't normally say or tell the story of a religious scene or a myth or whatever, although it can, if it's called like that. Later in conceptual art, we see that would happen. But often what would happen was that a lot of abstraction could be explored, and also just dedicating to the problems of form and to the problems of representation. Although the different artists and different movements of the avant-garde treated this very differently, and also, of course, most of these artists picked up the motive of the still life to develop their own personal interpretations, and also to bring something from their own repertoire. So, for example, if we compare a still life from a surrealist like Salvador Dali or De Chirico, who was a little bit before the surrealist, metaphysical painting, if we compare them with still life from Picasso, we see completely different approaches and completely different styles of representation. So in the case of Picasso, we already discussed a lot, but for example, in the case of De Chirico, we see still lives which are often integrated in sort of urban settings, although they are also there's distorted perspectives, and so they are really evoking this kind of ideal landscape of dreams, but they also incorporate objects which we would see existing in the traditional still life, like for example a bust with a face of a character or looking like a sculpture, but also some bananas or a mirror or a tiny human figure that doesn't really look like a figure. So the idea of this still life in comparison with Picasso has not so much to do with a manifesto on representation, but it has to do again with symbolic meaning and creating a narrative through the representation. So De Chirico's metaphysical paintings, for example, really explore this idea of what later would be called the unconscious, these interior landscapes, and also associations one can do often with kind of paradoxical effects that we cannot completely make sense of it, because they are representations also of a subjective interior world, but also highly scenographic for that reason. The other example of the surrealists that I just gave before was, for example, Salvador Dali, who also developed a lot of still lives. From one side, picking up, Salvador Dali was very interested in this hyper-realistic style of representation in painting, although he also worked with other techniques that really developed also the art the art movement. He also worked with techniques of appropriation and objet trouvé, and also with collage a few times. So we made a bit of a big jump here from until the surrealists, and we will get here to I will explain you a little bit more about these techniques of appropriation and assemblage and so on, but this is for the next lesson. But the whole idea was to tell you that this was through the avant-garde how the representation of the still life evolved. So first, in the beginning, very, very realistic, so naturalistic depiction of the character, of the objects. Then progressively towards the abstractions that we could see with Cubism, and then again a return to a more realistic style of representation, also with the incorporation again, like Picasso had already done, of material objects, so fragments of table pasted as in the canvas, so as part of the canvas. This was also continued this kind of technique also by another pioneer that absolutely revolutionized the art world and revolutionized the still life genre, which was Marcel Duchamp. So Marcel Duchamp developed something he called the ready-made. And the ready-made is this technique or this approach of picking up objects which already exist in the material world, so they exist in reality, take them out of context, put them together to create a story in a different context, creating a different context. So one of the most known examples of this is the fountain, which is a urinal, so this object where a man can pee, which was Marcel Duchamp reversed it, so changed this position and used it as an artwork and called it a fountain. So this pissoir, so this object to urinate on, became a fountain. Of course, this was a highly provocative gesture. It was made to question and to stir the ideas of the bourgeoisie. So at the same time, it was a kind of social and political critique. But in terms of artistic representation, it also showed that an artist does not have to be limited to the surface of the canvas to explore this kind of still life representation, giving it, so freeing it from painting and giving it spatial, sculptural quality, while at the same time picking up the same idea of the objects of the real world, so these humble, modest, worthless objects of the real world, put together in a different context to create a work of art. So Marcel Duchamp really did it. He really revolutionized art in this way. And after this, of course, we had many others who developed these ideas, who then came assemblage and so on and so on. Andy Warhol, and we had all these other, Rauschenberg, all these other groups of artists who from then on were able to say, not just in the still life genre, although we can say that it started there, that there is no topic which is not worthy of interest to make an artwork. No topic and no material. So from then on, the possibilities became endless. Yeah, so we end with Marcel Duchamp for today. I hope you found this lecture enjoyable and that you had a good overview about these topics. You have the complementary material on the website on Moodle, so you can follow. You have the support material for your Aufgabe in the Moodle. The artists and some of the artwork that I mentioned in the video, I will also upload on Moodle a collection so that you can take a look at them and have take some time and look at the pictures and think a little bit about what was discussed in the video and how it's manifested in this example. And in the next lesson, we will continue to address how the still life evolved into more and more material kinds of representation. So, thank you.